Okay. So a federal judge in New York today granted a Justice Department request to release grand jury material related to Ghislaine Maxwell's case, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator. She is a convicted child sex trafficker. She was convicted, I think, on 6 felonies back towards the end of 2021 after a jury trial. And U.S. District Judge Paul Engel Meyer said in his ruling that he has taken great care to put in place mechanisms to protect victims from the inadvertent release of materials within the discovery in this case that would identify them or otherwise invade their property. Now, there had been a previous request to release the grand jury material for Ghislaine Maxwell's case. And one thing to understand, it's my understanding that the grand jury in this case really only heard from one witness, and that was an FBI agent who summarized the DOJ's investigation, the FBI's investigation, summarized testimony from witnesses and victims, and that there's really no new information in the grand jury materials themselves. Because they just had to sustain the indictment. The burden of proof in front of the grand jury is much less than it is when you're at an actual trial. And obviously, an FBI agent talking about things that other people said is hearsay. Prosecutors are permitted to use, which would be inadmissible at trial, except for some exceptions. Prosecutors are allowed to use evidence in front of a grand jury that would be inadmissible at trial. Again, much lower standard of proof, burden of proof in front of a grand jury. And so, but this quote from the judge about protecting victims' identities from inadvertent release of materials within the discovery in this case indicates to me that the judge is releasing more than just the grand jury materials, and also plans on releasing the discovery in the case that the prosecution has to give to the defendant and her attorneys, which is all of the evidence that the prosecution intended to use at trial to convict her. That is a much more expansive universe than just the grand jury materials. And I heard one commentator on TV earlier today talking about this discovery stuff. And I was like, oh, there might be some actual new information contained in the discovery. Because, I mean, put it this way. The prosecution has to give the defense everything that the prosecution intends to use at trial. They may not have used all of that material at trial, but the stuff that they did use at trial is already publicly known because that trial was public. But so there may be some stuff the prosecution didn't use that hasn't been publicly released yet, but, you know, don't get your hopes up too high with the Ghislaine Maxwell stuff that we're going to learn anything new. However, a few days ago, a federal judge in Florida ordered the release of grand jury investigations into Jeffrey Epstein from 2005 and 2007. Those were the first two times in Florida and West Palm Beach that he was investigated. And if you want to learn more about that, watch the documentary on Netflix. I think it's a 3 or 4 part documentary. It is incredibly interesting. It's called Filthy Rich, Jeffrey Epstein, and it is all about that case, those first couple cases in Florida in 2005 and 2007. They have a lot of interviews with victims. They have a lot of interviews with prosecutors and attorneys representing the victims. And in that case, prosecutors at the DOJ, had determined that there were a dozen or more minors that Epstein was abusing. They had put together a massive proposed indictment with dozens of felony counts. And then the case somehow ended up in the hands of Jim Acosta, the U.S. attorney for the southern part of Florida. He took it away from state prosecutors. And then Epstein's very expensive Attorneys swooped in and they worked out a sweetheart deal for him where he pled guilty to one count of soliciting sex for a minor and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He served 13 months, but he had work release from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, where allegedly he continued to abuse minors and girls while he was actually serving his fucking sentence. So I wouldn't keep my hopes up for too much new stuff for this release.